All right, I didn't start that earlier. So in as is, all parties agreed the property is being sold as is. The purchaser, or excuse me, the seller still has to maintain the property from the effective date. Okay, so that doesn't change. So that doesn't mean they just let it fall down. Subject to normal wear and tear, they have to maintain it. And then the buyer has the right to inspect the property by a certain date, but quite frankly, this sentence is irrelevant because the seller is under no obligation to remedy any issues that the buyers discover in their inspection, and the buyer may not terminate the contract based on the results of any of the inspections conducted. Okay, so to put it very, very bluntly on this is not as is, meaning, hey, I'm going to purchase your property, I'm going to get it inspected, I probably don't care about anything, but I'm definitely not going to ask you to fix anything. Right? That's not what this means. This literally means Carrie puts a contract on a house, she goes and inspects the house. The most handy person on the planet can absolutely do all work, has contractors, it makes sense financially. She gets out to the house, she finds out it's built on top of a nuclear power plant sinkhole that you can't even step foot on it. Unless the seller knew and didn't disclose and you take them to court and prove that, she still has to purchase the house. There's no real gray area in this. The reason that I kind of harp on it so much is people throw out the term as is, basically meaning, yeah, don't worry, I won't ask you to fix for anything, right? And that's part of what as is means. You can't ask them. But what typically people mean is I won't ask you to fix anything. However, if the house is in worse shape than I realize, then I still want the opportunity to get out. This gives them no opportunity to get out. Okay. Now, there are questions on what happens when the as-is part conflicts with the CL 100 or any of that. As always, the goal of the contract is not to win the earnest money. And the goal of the contract is to have a buyer and a seller mutually agree on purchasing a home, go to closing, and both be happy with the sale that was there. So yes, we can try to split those hairs. Just know that as is, your buyer's at a huge risk. Now, as a listing agent, a lot of people on the listing agent side will say, well, this is great for my seller. I mean, they have to sell. Well, maybe. Or they have to buy. The problem is if the buyer's expectations weren't that and they were improperly informed, I don't care how much the buyer looks at the black and white of the contract. If they find out something terribly wrong with this, they don't care what as it says, right? Right? If they didn't truly understand what it meant, they're going to fight it. And it will more than likely come back to the buyer's agent for not explaining it correctly, the listing agent because they're a real estate agent. Everyone will be drug into it. So if you're a listing agent and you get an offer that says as is, there's nothing wrong with picking up the phone and saying, hey, thank you so much, Latia, for the offer on the property. I saw that it was as is. I do want to make sure, and please don't take any offense to this question, I do want to make sure that the buyer's understanding of as is means they can't get out. I'm not telling you that because we know of anything wrong with the property, but I do know a lot of times buyers think as is something different. Okay, so just make sure you clarify that. All right, so let's jump back into the contract. Any questions so far before I jump back into the contract? Okay, awesome. Now, go back into it. All right, due diligence. So due diligence is the second option. Used to be the most popular option until this market, and might, quite honestly, be the only option moving, in the next couple of years, because it really is the one that truly creates a 100% objective platform from which buyers and sellers can come to an agreement, right? So what the due diligence is, and I'll go through it line by line, but it's basically saying that we're going to have a period of time that begins on the effective date and expires at 6 p.m. on whatever date that may be. You'll pick a date. I would say for due diligence, no fewer than 2 weeks out if you truly want to get an inspection done, be able to negotiate and everything there. Because there's only one deadline in due diligence. There's not you have to ask by this and respond by that, and this is qualified, this is not. It basically says you've got this period. So we're just going to use, for this example, 2 weeks, right? Today's, we ratified on the 1st, you got to the 15th. That's it, right? So if you don't have an answer or you don't have all your information as a buyer on the 14th, you need to prepare yourself to either exercise the right to terminate or get an extension. Now, what happens during this time, the buyer may take timely, prudent steps to help buyer inspectors, seller estimators, and realtors all have adequate time for the buyer to coordinate their inspections and repair requests, the seller to obtain repair estimates, and the buyer and seller to negotiate repairs. Buyer potentially timely, properly due diligence, terminate, or buy. Okay, so again, like I'm saying, you want to give enough time for all inspections to be done, negotiations to be done. You got to take into consideration from the buyer side, the seller doing research on quotes or anything like that. Okay. During this time frame, during the due diligence period, the seller agrees the buyer may rely on the following list of 5 items in acceptance with the contract law. Buyer is solely responsible for inspections. That's just something to keep in mind. Don't request a further evaluation. Shouldn't do that at any time, but particularly in due diligence. Buyer is not required to inspect until buyer timely, promptly terminates the contract or the parties agree on an amended contract. The buyer can rely on number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Time is of the essence. This is very important, and this will all make sense as we go into the next one. Delivering a repair request does not extend the due diligence period. The reason they put this in here is years ago, before they had it, the contract read, you just had to respond with your request by the end of a certain period, and then that response determined the timelines afterwards. Nothing extends on this without an agreement that specifically states all parties are okay with the due diligence time date moving forward to X. And that's done one of 2 ways, an addendum or crossing through and changing this date up here, having both parties initial. So here's what happens during the due diligence time. Conduct, obtain inspections, either on site conditions, off-site conditions, again, not required, but can be done. Deliver a repair request or notice to the seller using Form 525 with all repair requests and then portions of the report. Again, not required, but you have the opportunity to do it. You can then proceed under amended contract, meaning you've renegotiated based on the inspections that were there. Okay, so and we'll walk through scenarios. Number 4, you proceed under as is contract, as meaning the buyer desires to buy anyway. They want the property without repair. Or lastly, you terminate the contract with timely, properly delivering notice of termination and delivering the termination fee should you have opted to do that. And you have to do all of that within the due diligence period as stated here. Okay, so to take it just to a 30,000 foot level, I put the property under contract on the 1st. I've got until the 15th. During that time, I had the property inspected. I submitted using Form 525, which we'll go cover during today's class. Okay, I'm going to use the same example. I think I was talking about Carrie was the buyer, Latia was the seller, right? So I'm going to submit to Latia the repair request. Latia is going to write back and say no, or sure on half of them, or yes to all of them, or somewhere in between. Carrie at that point can say, great, I agree. If she doesn't agree 100%, or she can say, no, I don't agree with you. If you don't come to terms, then by the 15th, you have to have Carrie either has to be okay with purchasing the contract, the property as it is, or terminating. If you do not, okay, let me go back. If you do not terminate during the due diligence period, it's very bold print. Buyers fail to obtain a new amended contract, the seller, or fail to terminate or timely, properly due diligence terminate the contract during the due diligence period, the buyer agrees to buy and the seller agrees to sell the property as is, and then it defines as is like it just did, like we did earlier in the contract. Okay, so here's the situation here's how this plays out. Okay, so Carrie submits the documents to Latia. Latia says, got it, that's great, I'll get back to you. It's now 12 o'clock on the 15th, and we've got till 6 o'clock to have something worked out. What do you do? What should Carrie do as the buyer or buyer's agent?
I guess probably request an addendum to the time.
Okay, let's say that wasn't going to be my answer, but from a diplomatic standpoint, I do think, yes, that would be a good way to start. And, send over to Latia, here's a request for an extension. What if I don't hear back and it's now 5 o'clock?
Make sure the buyers are ready to buy as is.
Okay, and if they're not? because that's a good point, Jennifer. You could come back and the buyer could be like, look, I mean, I would have loved to do some of it, but honestly, if they're not going to give back to me, I'll buy the house as is. Okay, let's say, but they're not. They're saying, listen, I just think it's ridiculous. You know, I'm not gonna do everything. They need to at least do something. What's the one leverage that you have as a buyer?
Terminate.
Correct. Notice of termination. So in the due diligence period, it's a unilateral right, meaning Carrie doesn't need Latia's permission to terminate. Right? She can terminate honestly on day 2. She can walk in the house and say, hey, I don't like how the dust particles are floating through the air when the sun shines through the skylight at 2:02. Right? I mean, it can be that silly. And by the way, you need to prepare your seller for that, which is why a lot of sellers aren't accepting it. Okay. So what can happen at that point, let's say 5:30 rolls around and you've just got, Jennifer the buyer just doesn't want to do anything, or is like, or sometimes the buyer like, this is ridiculous. I understand it's a seller's market, but I think they need to do something and they're not even responding. All that Carrie has to do is send a notice of termination, which will go through that contract or that document as well, to the email address that's on the contract, either with Latia or the seller, and send to them and saying, hey, per the due diligence, we are terminating this. And it's terminated at that point. You do not need, it's a unilateral termination. Okay. Now, a couple of things on this before we jump into the other documents and then we go through scenarios. There is a due diligence termination fee. Okay. This is not a super used paragraph right now because, quite frankly, not a lot of people are using this right now. I would start to encourage as a strategy, maybe go to your buyer and say, listen, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, yes, repair procedure, as we'll talk about shortly, it says they're required to fix some things, but there's also an open for interpretation on that requirement and those things. Due diligence gives you the free-for-all, right, to basically cancel for any reason. However, sellers are very reluctant in this market to take that. So why don't we go in with a due diligence, but then have a termination fee of X amount, and that X amount can be whatever you're willing to walk away from should you just not come to any sort of agreement on what the seller will fix, right? Again, we're seeing, locally, we don't really see this hit much more than a couple $1,000 because there's another option with repair procedure. Should the repair procedure ever go away, then you may have a market like they have in Raleigh where they're seeing $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 plus termination fees, which is ridiculous. But again, the seller's going to take their house off the market. The buyer better be serious about it. Okay. So let's quickly look at the 2 docs that will be used. So you go through due diligence and you come up with a list of repairs. You're then going to use form 525, which is the repair request proposal. And this is the document that you would submit your requests on. People are also using this for repair procedure. It's not necessary. However, it does give you it's technically not even designed for repair procedure. However, if you do use it, it helps organize the thoughts, so to speak. It basically says that the parties agree that at the seller's expense, the seller will do the work using qualified repair workers. Now, this is qualified repair workers does not mean everything has to be done by a licensed contractor. Party agrees that the intent of this contract, the seller will always hire qualified repair workers, licensed, bonded, etc., for all repairs except the most basic repairs, i.e. the seller might be qualified and adequately paint a portion of the property or remove a dead tree or other basic repairs. This line you can put on here I can't highlight it. You could put on there what the seller intends on doing themselves. But again, this is an area where people get kind of crazy because, the buyer wants a licensed, bonded, insured structural engineer to go out and replace a faceplate on an outlet. And it's like, okay, that's not going to happen. So just make sure that the buyers understands, the expectations of that. Repair related documents, reports, blah, blah, blah. If you have that attached, you'd want to select it here so it references it. Then this is where you get a little crazy, because this starts to rewrite the contract a little bit. The contract allows you let me pull that up really quickly. So the contract, a lot of people don't realize, already stipulates the time for everything to be done in paragraph or section 9. It basically says, actually, hold on. No, it does. It's not section 9 though. Yep, okay. So sellers will make the property accessible for inspections, and then within 48 hours prior closing date, that the buyer has the right to perform a final walkthrough. So if you haven't changed this, as a side note, the buyer can't be like, well, I want to do a walkthrough the week before. Well, you're welcome to do so, but I don't have to let you do it. Like, it doesn't have to be ready till within 48 hours prior to the closing date. Okay. So just keep in mind on that one. The reason I say that is because this contract, the Form 525, tends to rewrite it, because what it says is agreed that the seller shall complete the repairs no later than blank calendar days prior to closing. And then the buyer shall deliver repair cure notice, meaning I've gone out and re-inspected it, and there are some repairs that need to be done or cured or not, that weren't done properly. And then that notice needs to be given X days. So I would just say, let's, for giggles, this is 10. This is 5 days, and then the seller shall cure any of those repairs no later than 2 calendar days. Okay, so I know that was just incredibly confusing because I told it to you in a terrible way. But so basically, here's what would happen: is you would agree to say, okay, Carrie's requesting, Latia again, here are the repairs that I want done. I want you to have them done 10 calendar days prior to closing, and then I'm going to re-inspect, and I'm going to go out and say, okay, 5 days prior to, if there's anything that needs to be completed that wasn't completed, I'm going to let you know, and then you have to have that done 2 days prior to. That's basically the more simplistic way for me to explain what I just butchered in the prior one. So, and then best practices for agreeing upon repairs are to write in the blanks below. Number 1, the repairs. Number 2, a specific reference to a specific repair recommendation in a specific attached document. Okay, to avoid vague repair requests referencing the attached document. If using a repair procedure, notate each as seller paid repairs. Okay, again, I think that's a little unnecessary, because if they're not seller paid repairs, I don't know why you'd be putting them on here. But that's what they're recommending if you do it during the repair procedure. And then basically, honestly, in my opinion, ignore 4. I think, and I'll explain to you why when we get to a repair procedure. It'll make more sense. But really, the first 3 are great advice. Here are the repairs, okay? Because here's what happens is, and I see this all the time, and if you've done this, I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but if making you feel bad prevents you from doing it again, then I'll live with that, because it's very, very sloppy. Because a lot of people, Carrie will send the report and say, see attached report. And then it's, either the 48-page, inspection, or the summary page that's just too open for interpretation. You want to take the time and say, plumbing repair, sink and master bath is leaking. Item number 4.1, inspection report. Repair. Request to repair or replace, right? What happens is you get very vague, and some things that you want to be very careful on both of these is, I'll just use the same example, everyone. Sink and master bath is leaking. Request further evaluation and repair if necessary. What does that mean, right? I mean, your plumber gets out and the water pressure that day happens to be less and you're not leaking. He gets out and says, well, I evaluated it. It ain't leaking, right? Where we see this a lot are things like roofs or plumbing inspections or HVAC, right? Buyer requests licensed HVAC technician evaluate unit and repair if needed. Don't do that. Like if you want to have, like, as the buyer, that's what the buyer should be doing, is inspecting it. Now, if the HVAC or the inspector said HVAC is not blowing cold enough and needs Freon or whatever it is, then because here's why they do it. I shouldn't be so cynical. The reason most agents do it is because they're just copying and pasting what the inspector said. And 9 times out of 10, it's always recommend further evaluation. Just take that out. You either have enough information as a buyer or you don't. So if you don't, then get another inspection, or based on what the inspector told you, in this case, you'd say buyer requests repair of HVAC by replacing Freon or replacing, causing it to work, right? Whatever the specific request is. If the inspector says, hey, the HVAC difference in temperature is only 12 degrees and it should be 15 degrees, then the request would be seller to have licensed insured HVAC technician repair unit to reflect X difference in temperature. So it's a specific ask. So if you don't have a specific ask as a seller, when I see that, what's going to stop me from calling Joe Schmo HVAC to come out and say, hey, does this really need anything? I mean, I don't think it's that big of a deal. And they're going to be like, no, it doesn't need anything. And they're going to sign it, they're going to write an invoice that says inspected, no need to, repair the property. It doesn't. And again, it's not always malicious, right? It's just the seller's been probably living with this problem for 5 years and didn't even know it was a problem. And so they're like, hey, why is this a problem now? So just want to be very specific on it. Now let's go back to it. So then we talk about if seller fails to complete the repairs upon the repair agreement, the buyer shall accept the property as is, negotiate and reach an agreement or terminate this agreement, and potentially seek legal remedies against the seller. You would think this isn't a necessary document or statement in a document. I can't tell you in the last 3 months how many times sellers have been just crazy busy. They know what the market is. They send a contractor out there to do a laundry list of things. They get to the day before closing and the buyer does the walkthrough and 8 out of the 10 items are done. And the seller's like, look, I've moved out. I'm not going to have the guy come back, take it or leave it kind of thing. Or, here's $500. The seller, be careful on that. If you represent the seller, it's not always that simple, right? It's not always that simple. So then you go to the next page, you have more room to fill everything in. And then you have this last one, which is the modification of the contract. Basically says if you sign this and you get a ratified Form 525, you basically modified the contract and you've removed any due diligence right to terminate from the buyer at this point. Okay. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it overrides the CL 100. It doesn't override the where the money comes from, the financing contingency. But it does at this point removes any sort of repair inspections. Now, a couple things. The expiration. Yes, you will use an expiration date in due diligence if you're the buyer. So again, let's use the same time frame. I get an inspection. I submit this request on the 10th. I want to give the seller enough time to do their research, but I also want to make sure I have enough time to decide whether or not how I want to respond to their response. So if I'm submitting this on the 10th, I might give them to the end of the day on the 13th. Right, because I know then I have the 14th and the 15th to either ask for an extension, accept it, or terminate. Okay. Now, one thing to keep in mind before we get into it, is specifically the expiration date here does not extend any due diligence period and does not change the contract's time frame for the seller to respond under any repair procedure. I cannot tell you how many times that I get into this right now because they're doing repair procedure. The buyer's agent sends this over and they want to know by the end of the day tomorrow when the contract says they've gotten to the end of the day Saturday. I've had brokers get into arguments with me. You can't unilaterally change a contract by putting an expiration in here. Okay. Now, you can do it for due diligence, Doesn't mean the seller has to respond by then. If they don't, you've got till due diligence to decide whether or not you want to buy. Doesn't change your time frames in the repair procedure though. When was this contract written? I'm about to share with y'all a secret aha. Hold on. I hate when, hold on. 2020. Wow, that's interesting. So I am just having aha. I forgot that this last sentence here was in the repair addendum. And the reason I'm laughing is because I promise it's like been like 5 or 6 times over the last 2 months where I've had to get on as the broker and say, listen, I understand that your buyers want to hear sooner on the repair procedure, but this does not modify the contract. And I've made the argument that an addendum can't do it, which is a correct argument. However, they've literally added the sentence to address that situation in here. All right, so there's 30 seconds you'll never get back. All right, questions so far about due diligence? All right, let's go to repair procedure. Everybody's favorite. So repair procedure, basically, as I've always explained it, is pre-agreed upon repairs. Okay, you're basically going to repair procedure. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and we'll go back to, if you're talking to a buyer and you're going to explain to your buyer, listen, the seller, we've got multiple offers, we've got a competitive market. Right now, unless you're willing to have a very large termination fee, the seller is probably more than likely just going to require a repair procedure or don't submit an offer. So now I'm willing to try whatever. However, in speaking to the listing agent, this is what they've shared with me. Now, Mr. Buyer, if you go into repair procedure on this, you just need to know that this is basically pre-agreed upon repairs. All right. And what I mean by that is in the contract, it basically says, we're going to go under contract, under repair procedure, and then we're going to have inspections, and any inspections and requests shall be completed and delivered to the seller by 6 p.m. on blank date. Let's use the same time frame. Let's just, for even numbers, the first, we've got to have inspections done, and then we have to have a request to the seller by the 10th. Okay, so we're at the 10th. Any and all requests that are necessary, and this is where the pre-agreed upon place comes in, is they are, they're not required, but in order to stay in contract, if there are any necessary requests to place the heating, air conditioning, electrical, plumbing, water supply, waterway systems to be conveyed in operative condition, or to make the roof free of leaks, to address any environmental concerns, and to make the improvement structurally sound, which we're summarizing by calling repair requests, should be delivered by the deadline above. Okay, so we're going to have it inspected. If anything comes up, again, this is if we're following, black and white to a T of the contract. Anything comes up regarding those 9 systems, then we're going to let the seller know and request for the seller to fix them. Seller paid repairs. If we do not do that by the time given above, the buyer shall have waived any and all rights under the terms of this section. Now, it doesn't default it to as is yet, because it says if the lender's commitment requires any additional inspections and certificates, these are to be provided by the buyer. Buyer at buyer's expense shall have the privilege and responsibility of inspecting the structure, square footage, environmental concerns, everything else, plus more, after the fact, but it's going to be their responsibility at that point. And then the last line, sorry, it's scrolling down pretty quickly. Upon the seller's request, the buyer will, not shall, not may, it's will, provide with a copy of the inspection report. Okay, so this is a big one too. I actually just had a inspector teach a CE class that said that the buyer can't give it to the seller based on his contract that he has when a buyer hires him. So that's something to keep in mind. If a seller requests a copy of the inspection per this, and they're under repair procedure, your buyer has to give it to them per this contract, okay? So they've submitted that request of the seller paid repairs, and then this states no later than 6 p.m., and we're gonna go with the 15th, just to keep even dates. So the seller's got 10 days to figure out what all they, whether or not they agree that it's required and what the cost is. Seller shall deliver notice agreeing or not agreeing to make repairs in the buyer repair request. The cost of all repairs to heating systems, the ones we listed before, are to be paid by the seller. It then goes on to say, seller paid requests do not include the following items: home maintenance, flooring, which is vague, fogged windows, grandfathered code issues, landscaping, preventative maintenance, cosmetic changes, home improvement, and energy efficiency. If the seller contractually agrees to make all the required seller pays repairs, the buyers proceed under the contract. The repairs to any other items are solely the responsibility of the buyer. All right, so a couple things on this. Flooring is a big one to point out to your buyer, because flooring is basically saying flooring is not covered. Now, if there is a structural integrity issue with the joist, that's one thing. But if you've got creaky floors, you've got flooring coming up, you've got whatever it may be, it is not covered. Okay? Now, that's the first one that comes an issue. The second one that always comes up an issue, windows. Now, it specifically states fogged windows in here. So if there are fogged windows in there, they're not covered. They're specifically stated they're not covered. Now, the next one is, well, the windows don't open. This is a gray area. In my opinion, they are not covered. Okay, there's nothing that says the window is part of the systems that need to be functional. Now, some people argue safety. Safety is specifically not covered. Safety items are not part of repair procedure. I'm not saying this is rational. Let me just be very, very clear, right? We run into this a lot with like electrical and everything there. But when you just need to understand that it's not a safety, and we're dealing with this right now with an agent in one of our offices, incredibly seasoned agent, right? This isn't an experience thing in it by any stretch of the imagination. It just, you come up with new ones. Grandfathered code issues. If the roof was built before they were required to have the certain hurricane strapping on there, it's not protected. Now, if it were, if it's grandfathered in, basically. We see this a lot on electrical panels. If you've got an older house and the electrical panel is functioning correctly, but has 14 different mains or leads coming in to each breaker, as long as it's functioning, it could be a terrible safety hazard. It's not, it's a functioning electrical system. Okay. This is, by the way, why people don't like repair procedure. It's not as clear as people thought that it was. So it's just something to keep in mind. The other one is I did windows, electrical, safety. I did. The areas that you get a little gray are your condensation, especially in the crawl space. You know, if the condensation is being created by the HVAC, some would argue that it's not functioning properly. Others would argue that it's an HVAC or it's a environmental issue because you're creating an environmental hazard by possibly creating mold, mildew, etc. So just some things to keep in mind when these come up, especially if you haven't had a lot of experience with them. You know, always contact me, and also understand if you're getting into an interpretation of what's covered, there will be a time where we probably need to bring the attorney in. Again, that can be the closing attorney. You know, the closing attorney can come in and give a statement, and at the end of the day, the buyer and seller have to decide whether or not it's, you know, the hill they're going to die on as far as moving the contract forward. Okay. The last part of the repair procedure is another one that caused, I personally disagree with a lot of people's interpretation of it. However, you know, I'm not a lawyer. So, but basically what this says, the seller does not timely respond per above, or does not agree to make the seller paid repairs, the buyer shall, within 2 calendar days, choose any one of the following. I think I just realized why I can't agree kind of with people now, but we'll see. I should probably not record this one. I feel like I'm all over the place on today's class. But basically what this is saying is if the seller does not timely respond per above, or does not agree to make all the seller paid repairs, the buyer shall have 2 calendar days to either accept the property in the present condition, negotiate a new amended contract, or terminate the contract by delivered notice. Okay, again, it could be a unilateral termination. If they don't do one of those 3, the buyer agrees to buy as is in the same verbiage as before. Okay. Now, here's where I was confused, I disagreed, but I can see where I always would err on the side of making sure our buyers are protected. or our sellers are protected. If the seller, how I read this is the seller does not respond per above, meaning from this date here. So let's say this date was the 15th, right? Then they have 2 calendar days from the 15th to do one of these 3. Now, let's say in this example, they got the inspection and everything done and submitted on the 10th, right? The buyer was correct. And then the seller responded on the 11th. Okay. Well, now you have 2 days from when they do not agree to make all the seller repairs. So it changes it. And the change comes from this little or right here, which is why I think technically how it's written, it should be 2 calendar days from here. However, I don't encourage you to feel that way. I feel like we always default on the one that would be less of a risk, because at the end of the day, it's not up to you and me as the agents, right? It's up to the courts, which we don't want to get to. So if they've submitted the repair request and you're going to disagree, and the seller disagrees, you've got 2 days from when they disagreed. If they have not responded, then they've got 2 days from when they were supposed to respond. That makes sense? And then the rest closes out and goes right back down to due diligence. All right, questions? See why we got to do this one section completely separate from the rest of the entire contract? I mean, we covered a page of the contract in the 45 minutes. All right, so what questions? No problem, Jennifer. Let me see. All right, sounds good. Thanks, Jennifer. All right, who else? Anybody questions? Always quiet today.
Joseph, those last 2 are somewhat similar. What if you could pick out the main differences, like the biggest thing to say between those 2, repair procedure and due diligence? I see them kind of similar. How can we decipher like the biggest differences?
The biggest difference is on due diligence, there's no room for interpretation. You're either going to agree or disagree with whatever the buyer says or seller says, regardless of whether or not you agree or disagree with them, right? There's nothing pre-covered. Whereas repair procedure, sellers are told, and somewhat rightfully so, they're told, hey, what repair procedure says is they can't just come in and here's how the real world verbiage goes. You know, Carrie, here's the deal. With the repair procedure, they just can't come in and ask for anything in nickel and dime. Well, first of all, yes, they can. Anybody can ask for anything. Now, you're only required to cover what's stated in paragraph A under the repair procedure, paragraph A. The problem with that is the nitpicky stuff that comes into required, right? Like we've got one right now. I was just on the phone this morning about, there are 4 different things that quite frankly are open for interpretation. One of them is the irrigation system for the sprinkler system, or for the sprinkler system. Is that plumbing? Right? So it's like, it's not plumbing. I don't need it to plumb my house. It waters my lawn. Okay, well, your lawn irrigation system is actually covered under the maintenance paragraph. Was it working when you went under contract? Well, I don't know. All right, so that's just one small one where now all of a sudden emotions are involved because you as the buyer are saying it's clearly plumbing. There are pipes and there's water going through it, right? And the seller's like, I'm not going to fix this. And now all of a sudden it's like you both think you're right because you were told that it's specifically stated in the contract. Whereas due diligence, the emotion's out. Carrie's like, listen, I want the irrigation addressed. Lucia says, no, I'm not going to address it. It's like at that point, like, okay, well, there's no emotion, right? I don't feel that anybody's required. I've got to determine whether or not me as the buyer is willing to lose the property or me as the seller is willing to lose the buyer. Yeah. I'm telling you, I used to think, even as a listing agent, before Lynn does mostly everything on the team now, but when I was heavy into the listing side, I was all on with repair procedure. I was like, absolutely. I mean, due diligence is terrible. Why would we do it? I used to even say it when I would teach the class. As a buyer's agent, I think due diligence is the best. As a seller's agent, I think repair procedure is the best. It's not. It's not. The due diligence is one of those where it's very clean, right? And once you're done, you're done. The negotiation's not Well, you're required. No, I'm not actually required to do anything. And now I also don't know that, it's worth me losing you as a buyer just to get $1,500 in termination fee and have to go back on the market. So, all right. Anything else? All right. Well, guys, if you need anything, let me know. Shoot me an email, and we will start. We'll be up and running on Mondays at 2 next week, and it will technically be the second week. We'll see what happens between now and then. If we've got new requests, we'll talk about that. Otherwise, we'll just go through the purchase and sale agreement. And then all these are recorded, and we're doing better at titling them, so it doesn't just say contracts class. That's helpful. And as much as you'd like to listen through the first 20 minutes of all the contracts classes to find out what it is, we're going to be specifically titling what the topics are. All right, guys. Thank you so much for being here. If you have any questions, feel free to call or email me. Bye.